The Texas heat pressed down like an iron, flattening every crease of the blue sky above the football field. Rows of folding chairs had been set out, each one filled with proud parents and restless siblings. The air was thick with perfume, sweat, and the faint scent of fried food drifting over from a vendor parked across the street. A brass band warmed up at the far end of the field, their notes clumsy but joyful, like the sound of a small town trying to hold on to its dignity. I held my phone in one hand and a water bottle in the other, my palms already slick. My daughter, Emma, was somewhere in the sea of gowns and mortarboards, her face just one among hundreds, yet the only one my eyes kept searching for. 4 years of late-night study sessions, tear-stained notebooks, and whispered pep talks in the kitchen had led to this single walk across a stage. My heart swelled until it hurt. Beside me, my sister fanned herself with the program, complaining about the heat, while my nephew Caleb fidgeted against my hip. He was 9, full of sharp elbows and soft fears. I squeezed his shoulder whenever he got restless, reminding him we were almost at the fun part. The pictures, the hugs, the release of balloons in the sky. The ceremony itself was a blur of names and clapping. Emma's moment came and went in 30 seconds, but I felt the world pause when she shook the dean's hand, her smile breaking open like sunlight. I clapped so hard my palms stung. My girl, my stubborn, brilliant girl. After the speeches, we shuffled into line near the stage for the family photos. Everyone was buzzing, fixing their caps, tugging on their gowns, laughing too loud. My sister cracked a joke about my mascara already smudging, and I swatted her arm. The air was loud with joy. Then Caleb gripped my wrist. Not the lazy tug of a bored kid, but something desperate, almost bruising. I turned to him, startled. His face had gone the color of chalk, his lips trembling. His eyes weren't on me, they were locked on the stage. "What is it, baby?" I bent down, brushing sweat from his forehead. He leaned so close I could feel his breath shiver against my ear. Why is the man on the stage waving at me if he has no hands? For a moment, I thought I'd misheard him. My throat went dry. I pulled back and studied him, but his eyes were glassy, his body rigid. He wasn't teasing. He wasn't inventing a story. He was seeing something I wasn't. I glanced toward the stage, scanning the crowd of administrators milling about, their robes dragging across the wood. Nothing out of place, no one staring, no one waving, just the dean adjusting his glasses, a photographer wiping his lens. "Where?" I whispered. "There." Caleb's small finger twitched in the air, pointing directly at the empty side of the stage where sunlight cut across the floorboards. He yanked his hand back quickly, as though the act of pointing might draw attention. His breath hitched, and he clutched my arm tighter. A ripple of cold threaded down my spine despite the blistering heat. My first instinct was to laugh it off, to tell him he'd imagined it, that shadows play tricks when the sun is strong, but the words dried in my throat when I saw the raw terror in his eyes. I crouched lower, pressing my forehead against his. "It's okay," I whispered, more to myself than to him. "Maybe it's just your eyes playing tricks. Maybe you're tired," but he shook his head, his jaw set stubbornly. Caleb wasn't a dramatic child. If anything, he was careful with words, too old for his age. He wasn't lying. He wasn't confused. I held him until his breathing slowed, all while forcing a smile for the camera when Emma bounded toward us, cheeks flushed with victory. I hugged her tight, whispering how proud I was, how this was only the beginning. The photographer shouted at us to squeeze closer, and I forced my lips into a grin, my hands still trembling around my children. Somewhere behind the flashbulbs and the laughter, the image of an unseen man waving lingered, etched like a burn into the edge of my mind. That night, after the ceremony, the house was full of laughter and clinking glasses. Emma sat at the dining table with her cousins, still wearing her cap tilted at a ridiculous angle, retelling the moment she almost tripped walking up the stage. My sister kept refilling plates with barbecue, and my brother-in-law fussed over the brisket like he'd invented fire itself. I should have been floating on the high of the day. My daughter's diploma sat framed on the mantel, a testament to everything we had survived together. But Caleb's whisper replayed in my head like a broken tape. Why is the man on the stage waving at me if he has no hands? I caught him more than once at the edge of the table, picking at his food and staring toward the window. When I asked if he was all right, he forced a nod, but the dark circles under his eyes told me the answer. Kids don't fake that kind of fear. They don't carry dread like that without reason. Later, when the dishes were stacked and the laughter died down, I walked past the living room. Caleb was curled up on the sofa, crayons scattered around him. I bent to gather the mess, then froze. On the paper was a stick figure drawn in thick, heavy strokes, arms ending abruptly in jagged stumps. Above the figure's shoulders, he had scribbled 2 dark circles, hollow and uneven, like eyes staring out from behind a veil. My throat tightened. "Sweetheart, what's this?" Caleb glanced up, his voice flat. "It's him." 100 explanations crowded my tongue. Too much TV, a spooky story from school, maybe a prank he'd overheard, but none of them reached my lips. Instead, I folded the drawing and slipped it into my apron pocket, telling him gently it was bedtime. He obeyed too quickly, as if glad to escape the living room. When the house quieted, I stood by the mantel, running my fingers over Emma's framed diploma. Pride warred with unease inside me. I tried to remind myself that Caleb was a child, and children see things that aren't there. Imagination is powerful, especially when the world is charged with so much emotion. But the certainty in his eyes, so cold, so adult, gnawed at me. In the days that followed, life pressed on with its usual demands. Emma filled out job applications, my sister dropped by with leftover casseroles, and I kept the house running like a well-oiled machine. Yet shadows seemed thicker, corners sharper. Every creak of the floorboards at night made me glance twice. One morning, as I folded Emma's gown to store it in her closet, I caught sight of our family photo on the dresser. For a split second, I swore there was something blurred behind us in the background, a faint smudge where no person had been standing. I blinked hard, held the frame closer, and told myself it was nothing but glare on the glass. Still, my pulse didn't slow. Caleb grew quieter, too. At dinner, he pushed peas around his plate, his eyes darting toward the darkened hallway. Once, when a car's headlights swept across the window, he jerked so violently his fork clattered to the floor. When I pressed him, he whispered, "He's still watching." I wanted to promise him it was just shadows. I wanted to tell him mothers know best, that nothing could touch us in this house. But the words caught in my throat, because a small traitorous part of me had started to wonder if he was right. That night, as I lay in bed, Emma's laughter echoing faintly down the hall, I stared at the ceiling fan slicing the darkness. A single question pulsed in my mind, heavy and unwelcome. What if the graduation wasn't just a celebration, but the start of something we couldn't explain? By the end of that week, I was tired of second-guessing myself. I wanted ordinary life back, the kind where my biggest concern was whether Emma remembered to take her job application seriously or whether Caleb had done his math homework. But the house wouldn't let me forget. It started small. A stack of mail slid from the counter one morning, scattering across the floor. I bent to gather it, muttering under my breath, until I noticed one envelope had been pushed farther than the others, resting almost neatly under the hallway closet door. I picked it up and frowned. It was blank, no stamp, no address, just my name written in shaky ink across the front, Marian. I didn't open it. Couldn't. My hand shook too hard. By the time I set it aside on the counter, Emma breezed in, keys jangling, asking if she could borrow the car. I tucked the envelope beneath a cookbook and smiled like nothing was wrong. 2 nights later, Caleb woke screaming. I rushed to his room, my heart pounding, only to find him curled in the corner instead of in bed, his blanket balled in his fists. His eyes darted past me, fixed on the closet. "He was there," he whispered, hoarsely, "right there." Waving, I forced a shaky laugh. "Baby, you had a nightmare." "It's just shadows." But when I turned toward the closet, the door was cracked open, a thin sliver of dark yawning back at us. And I could have sworn, for the briefest, most impossible instant, that I saw the outline of an arm lifted in greeting, except it ended mid-forearm, the way Caleb had drawn it. I shut the door hard enough to rattle the hinges and scooped him up, rocking him against me until his trembling eased. He smelled of sweat and childhood fear. My own heartbeat thundered against his small chest, but I whispered the lies mothers are supposed to tell. "You're safe. It's over. Nothing can hurt you here." The next morning, sunlight felt like an accusation. Emma flipped pancakes in the kitchen, humming off-key, while Caleb sulked over his cereal. I sipped my coffee and tried to focus on the ordinariness of it all, but my eyes kept drifting to the family photos on the fridge. That's when I noticed it. One of the pictures Emma had taped up was from graduation, me hugging her on the field, the crowd blurred behind us. But over her shoulder, half obscured by glare, there was something else, a shape, a smear of pale against the stage's dark backdrop. At first it looked like nothing, but the longer I stared, the more it seemed to resolve into shoulders, a head, and the faintest suggestion of empty sleeves raised in a wave. I yanked the photo off the fridge, startling Emma. She laughed nervously. "What? Do I look that bad?" I shook my head, forcing a smile, and slipped it into the drawer by the sink. But the image burned into my mind. By the weekend, the tension in the house was thick enough to taste. Caleb refused to go into rooms alone. Emma grew irritated, chalking his nerves up to too much TV and not enough sunlight. But me, I'd stopped dismissing it. Something had followed us from that ceremony. I didn't want to say it out loud, not even to myself, but the truth gnawed at me with every shadow that lingered too long, every unexplained creak in the floorboards. This wasn't imagination, this wasn't coincidence. Something was here, and it was watching. It was a Wednesday night when I finally saw him. The house had settled into its familiar quiet, each room breathing in its own rhythm. Emma had gone out with friends to celebrate landing an interview, and Caleb had fallen asleep on the couch, clutching his comic book like a shield. I should have been folding laundry or prepping tomorrow's lunch, but I found myself wandering the hallway instead, restless, uneasy, like I was waiting for something I didn't want to name. The clock in the living room ticked too loudly, each second stretching into the next until it felt unbearable. I turned toward the window at the far end of the hall where the curtains were drawn tight, but a sliver of moonlight bled through the gap. That's when I saw movement. At first it was nothing, just the faint shift of shadow against shadow. But then, as my eyes adjusted, a figure resolved itself in the glass reflection. A man stood at the edge of the room, right where the hallway met the kitchen. He wasn't transparent like the stories tell it. He wasn't glowing or flickering. He looked solid, too solid, yet wrong. His shoulders hunched as though carrying a weight, his head bowed slightly, and where his hands should have been, the sleeves of a dark jacket hung loose, empty, as if the limbs had been erased. And still, he waved. The motion was gentle, almost kind, the way you might signal to a friend across a crowded street, except the sleeves stirred without hands inside them, brushing against the air with a mockery of normalcy. My knees locked, my throat dried, every rational thought clawed for purchase. This is a trick of the light, a tired mind, a woman too deep in her own fears, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. "Who are you?" The words came out cracked, barely audible. The figure stilled. Slowly, its head lifted, and though the face remained indistinct, blurred, unfinished, the hollowness where eyes should have been locked onto mine. A cold washed over me so sharp it stole my breath, and for one terrible heartbeat, I thought I might collapse right there on the hardwood floor. Behind me, Caleb stirred in his sleep, mumbling something I couldn't catch. The sound broke whatever thread held me frozen. I blinked hard, and in that fraction of a second, the figure was gone. Just the empty hallway, the ticking clock, the faint hum of the refrigerator. But the air still carried it, the cold, the presence, the unmistakable sense that I had been acknowledged. I hurried back to the couch, scooping Caleb into my arms, even though he was nearly too big for me to carry that way. His head lolled against my shoulder, his breath warm against my neck. I whispered to him, though he was fast asleep, "You're not imagining it." I saw him too. The admission lodged in my chest like a stone. There would be no more pretending, no more dismissing shadows as tricks of the light. Something had followed us home, and it wasn't finished. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the wave again, sleeves swaying against nothing, a greeting that felt less like welcome and more like a summons. By dawn, I sat at the kitchen table with a mug of untouched coffee, staring at the family photo Emma had hung proudly just days ago. The smudge behind us was no smudge at all. It was him. And now I knew. I wasn't just the protector of this family. I was also the witness. Whatever this was, it had chosen me too. I've never been the type to chase ghosts. Bills, deadlines, broken washing machines, that's the kind of haunting I'm used to. But after that night in the hallway, pretending it wasn't real felt impossible. And if something had followed us, if Caleb and I weren't both losing our minds, then I needed to know why. It started with small, practical steps. I drove to the high school 2 mornings later, under the excuse of dropping off forms for Emma's transcripts. The auditorium sat quiet now, stripped of its banners and balloons. But standing there in daylight, the place felt heavy, as if celebration had only been a thin layer of paint over something older. I found the janitor sweeping near the stage, a man with a lined face, eyes that looked like they'd seen everything twice. When I asked if anything strange had ever happened during ceremonies, his broom paused mid-sweep. "Strange how?" he asked cautiously. I hesitated, then settled for vague. "Like accidents. People who didn't make it across the stage?" His mouth pressed thin. "Long time ago, back when my dad worked here. Fire broke out during a graduation in the late 70s. Smoke filled the place fast. Most everyone got out, but one man, parent of a student, didn't. Folks say he went back inside looking for his daughter. They found him near the stage. Couldn't save him." He shook his head, resumed sweeping. "I don't know what you're looking for, ma'am, but if you're asking me..." Some things stay behind when there's no closure. I walked out with my stomach knotted. Closure. A man waving, sleeves empty. A father who never got to cheer for his child. That night, Caleb crawled into my bed before I'd even turned out the light. He clutched my wrist the same way he had at the graduation. "He was outside my window," he whispered, "just waving." I pulled him close, heart pounding. "What did he look like?" Caleb's voice trembled. Sad. That single word unraveled me, because I'd seen it too, the sorrow stitched into the blurred features, the heaviness in that slow, steady wave. It wasn't malice that lingered in our house. It was grief. Still, grief or not, it terrified my nephew, and it unsettled me in ways I couldn't push aside. So I did what I had always done when life demanded strength. I leaned into it. I sat at the kitchen table the next morning with my laptop, combing through old news archives. Fire at the auditorium. Graduation halted. 1 casualty confirmed. The man's name was Samuel Hayes, survived by his daughter, class of 79. I stared at the faded article photo, a man in a suit with proud eyes, hands tucked neatly at his sides, the same hands his spirit no longer seemed to carry. Emma breezed in halfway through my search, kissing my cheek before rushing out to meet friends. She didn't see the way I closed the laptop too quickly, didn't hear the way my breath shook. To her, life was just beginning. But I was starting to wonder if something unfinished had hitched itself to us, binding itself to my family through that stage where his own story had ended. That evening, I walked the house with the lights off, letting my eyes adjust to the shadows. "Samuel," I whispered into the stillness. My voice quivered, but I forced it. "Steady. If you're here, I see you." The silence thickened, pressing against my ears. Then from the far end of the hall came the faintest stir of movement. Not threatening, not cruel, just a sleeve lifting in acknowledgement. I didn't scream this time. I didn't run. I bowed my head, trembling but resolute. For the first time, I wasn't just the frightened mother. I was a woman bearing witness. It happened at the worst possible moment, because that's how these things always do. Emma's friends had thrown a small party at our house, a last hurrah before they scattered to colleges and jobs. The living room buzzed with music and laughter, red cups sweating on the coffee table, pizza boxes stacked in leaning towers. I busied myself in the kitchen, refilling bowls of chips, listening for the rise and fall of my daughter's laughter. She sounded so young still, though she carried a diploma now, a woman stepping into her own life. Caleb sat on the back porch, away from the noise, sketching quietly with his crayons. I'd tried to coax him inside, but he refused, his gaze flicking nervously toward the hallway every time he passed through. I didn't press him. Part of me envied his honesty. He wasn't pretending not to be afraid. It was sometime past 10 when the lights flickered. Just once, but enough to draw a collective groan from the teenagers. I grabbed a flashlight from the drawer, muttering about old wiring, but the unease in my stomach churned heavier. Then Emma screamed. Not the playful kind, not the shriek that comes with a jump scare from friends. A raw, startled sound that froze the room. I ran from the kitchen, flashlight beam jerking across faces until it landed on the far corner by the hallway. He was there. Not faint, not half seen, but standing clear as day, as though the veil had thinned to nothing. A man in a dark jacket, his form sharp against the wall, sleeves swaying though no hands filled them. He waved slowly, sorrow etched into the blurred hollows of his face. The room erupted. Teenagers shoved backward, knocking over cups, scrambling for the door. Emma stood rooted, her eyes wide, breath heaving like she'd run miles. Caleb burst in from the porch, his voice breaking. "See? I told you. I should have chased everyone outside, should have grabbed my daughter and dragged her into safety, but my feet stayed planted, because for the first time, the wave wasn't for Caleb. It was for me." His empty sleeves lifted higher, deliberate, his faceless gaze boring into mine as if begging, pleading to be recognized. "Samuel," I whispered. The name cut through the chaos. The air seemed to still, as though the house itself inhaled. For one suspended moment, no one moved. Then, like a candle flame guttering in wind, the figure dissolved, sleeves collapsing into the emptiness. Emma clutched my arm. "Mom, what was that?" "What did you say?" I couldn't answer. My throat was thick, my eyes burning. How could I? Tell her that while she was celebrating her future, we had dragged someone else's unfinished past into our lives. That the man waving wasn't trying to hurt us, but to remind us he'd once stood in the same place, waiting for his daughter's proud smile? The kids left in a hurry, murmuring nervously, avoiding my eyes. Word would spread, no doubt twisted into ghost stories before morning. But what haunted me wasn't their fear. It was Emma's expression. Bewildered, hurt, that her mother seemed to know more than she was saying. Later, after the house was quiet, I found Caleb asleep on the couch, his crayon drawings scattered across his chest. Each page was the same, a man with no hands, always waving, always watching. I gathered the drawings, pressing them flat as though order might soothe the chaos. My hands shook, not from terror this time, but from the weight of truth. We had seen him. All of us. There was no more pretending. And the worst part? A small part of me understood his sorrow, and in that understanding came a fear deeper than any haunting. What if grief binds us longer than love? The morning after the party, the house felt hollow, as though the laughter had been scraped clean from its walls. I moved slowly through the rooms, gathering empty cups, folding blankets left in heaps, righting chairs. Emma slept late, her door shut, her exhaustion heavy. Caleb trailed me like a shadow, quiet, his eyes darting to corners even when the sun poured in. I kept waiting for him, for Samuel to appear again, for the faint stir of sleeves at the edge of my vision, but the house remained still, and in that silence, I realized something. He didn't want to harm us. He wanted to be seen, to be remembered. Later that day, I drove back to the school. The auditorium doors groaned when I pushed them open, the scent of dust and polish settling in my lungs. I walked to the stage, stood where Emma had received her diploma, and placed a single flower on the wooden boards. "For your daughter," I whispered. No wave came, no shadows stirred, just sunlight spilling through high windows, warm on my face. And still, I felt lighter leaving than I had in weeks. Back home, life pressed forward. Emma prepped for her interview, nerves fraying her every sentence. Caleb slowly began to sleep through the night, though he still kept a nightlight burning bright. As for me, I returned to the small rituals: laundry folded warm, pancakes flipped golden, mornings spent at the kitchen table with coffee cooling too quickly. But every so often I'd catch myself glancing at the hallway, waiting for the familiar gesture that no longer came. I don't know if Samuel has finally found his rest. I don't know if we carried him for a reason or if we were simply caught in the drift of his grief. What I do know is this: witnessing him changed me. I used to think my role as a mother was to shield my children from everything sharp and dark, to insist the world is brighter than it sometimes is. But maybe strength isn't denial. Maybe it's looking straight into the shadows, naming them, and still finding the courage to keep living. These days, when I see Emma laughing with her friends, or Caleb sprawled on the floor drawing superheroes instead of ghosts, I feel a quiet gratitude. We are here, we are together, and we are stronger for what we've seen. And you, listening to me now, you're part of this story too. Because stories only live when they're shared. If you've stayed with me this far, thank you. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from, because sometimes the world feels smaller when we know our stories travel far. And if you've ever felt haunted by sorrow, by memory, by something you couldn't name, know this: you're not alone. Did you like my story? If you did, you can support me with a super thanks so I can keep bringing more life stories your way. On the screen, you'll see 2 others I think you'll enjoy. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next time, take care and keep your eyes open.